less that and more, if you don't recognize that there is there is magic at the very bottom, right? Then you're closing yourself off to the possibilities that might lead you to the next breakthrough, or that might preclude you from appreciating the incredible superpowers, right, that are ultimately attributed to I don't think that it's unfair to describe what's happening, say, in the quantum realm as magic. Like, there's no reason it has to be that way, but it is, and because it is, and because we understand it, we can do all sorts of things that wouldn't be possible. But I want to tie it to the blockchain. You had started going there, where, like, especially all of us that are involved, right, certainly feel that there's a lot of energy and momentum. And I go as far, as we have been for the past couple of minutes, describing it as magic. And so, I guess when in the various discussions we've had about Daemonica, what I see in Daemonica is the first serious attempt to, it's almost like it's like creating, like using the energy and using the magic that's inherent in the blockchain to animate an entity, or almost to create a basic, or at least what seems at the moment, who knows what it grows into, but to create the basic principle of life that is that's created out of this energy, that's latent in the blockchain, and then that can then actually be useful as an animated entity. So that's my attempt at describing it in my own words, but perhaps maybe that's a good point to hand over to you, and to give us an overview as to what it is and what its significance is.
Yeah. I think as always, you do a great job sort of summarizing complex issues that I end up usually getting trapped with. So what I'll show is, we put together this presentation for some friends and family not so long ago. And again, as a kind of caveat, this is a Canon presentation. It's not the product of the artist. So, the
Right.
artist doesn't necessarily endorse this interpretation, but it's kind of the story of Daemonica in short, and the elements of it that, it feels dorky to do a presentation over Zoom, but I think it'll just speed up the amount of time needed to describe it. So
sure.
For me, this is where it kind of starts, is this idea that we've talked about and around magic for the last however many minutes, and I think there's multiple concurrently true definitions of. You can give a number of definitions of magic, and they can all be true. One aspect of magic that I particularly find insightful is the idea that magicians manipulate reality maps. A reality map it's a toy model of reality, of the world that we experience, meaning it's a kind of, it's a distillation of something. And that map can literally be a voodoo doll. Like, I can make a voodoo doll of you, and that's a reality map of you in reality. And if that voodoo doll is sufficiently accurate, and sufficiently infused with my intention, then manipulating that map allows me to manipulate the territory, in this case, you. And so, you have to, the magic of the blockchain is latent in it, but in bringing it forth, that's also, there's a responsibility and an ethics of that. And so throughout this project, we've tried to maintain a kind of, not imprinting our own ethics on the project itself, I think, needs to be said. But one of the takes that I would take on this is, I've talked a little bit about the idea of, what I think an artist is. When you asked, is an artist a shaman? And I think one really good example of that is an artist of the 20th century, J.R.R. Tolkien, the guy that wrote Lord of the Rings. And, he wrote it basically he had this weird dream in 1913. He called it his Atlantean haunting. And it was this like big yellow wave that like kind of crashed over the world and then turned to red blood. Um, and so strangely, or maybe not so strangely, depending on the universe you think you live in, Carl Jung had the exact same dream around the exact same time. And for Jung, that led to a series of experiments that were only revealed 60 years later, 80, 100 years later, very recently, about a decade ago. And for Tolkien, there's been no real kind of smoking gun on whether or not Tolkien was doing kind of hardcore magic, but it's so obvious in just what he was kind of doing on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
So he got this dream in 1913. He didn't publish The Hobbit until maybe 25, I think, years later. And in the meantime, he made this kind of incredible corpus of maps, right? Like the one that you see on the screen of all these places, Mordor and Gondor and so on. And so there's like endless amounts of maps. He even made like star charts, astrological charts. So he had a concept of time and the kind of entities or bodies or influences on that time, moons and stars and so on. So significant moments in those books are actually, have their own kind of astrological charts. He created a 3,000-year plus history. These are all images from an exhibition that's been traveling the last couple of years. 3,000-year history of just this really, really rich history of this kind of Middle Earth. Languages, I think there's 21 different languages, all with their own alphabets that have like a genealogical tree. So like a language that spawned from another one and so on. And Tolkien was a philologist, so this was his kind of wheelhouse. A system of runes, so basically a system of magic, and even archaeological fragments of lost texts, right? And so this is an artistic production. The books are the things that we get our hands on. The books are the things that the public kind of consumes.
Mm-hmm.
But all of this, these are Tolkien's archives. He was making art. He was making art in the form of language and scribbles and maps and so on. And when asked about it in a lecture he gave, he talked about it as sub-creation. He wasn't the genius creator that came up with this stuff. He didn't make it up. He says he discovered it. And he discovered it by constantly going back into a state of almost dreamlike trance, where writing was basically him following a story that was playing out almost in his subconscious. And so that's where I feel like artist and shaman sort of like merge into a similar figure. And Tolkien, Jung, and so many others kind of follow this mold. And so when the Loot project came along, and it was not the first on-chain art project, but it was so basic, it was so primitive that and so evocative in its sort of like fantasy gameplay, that like, within very little time, it spawned this massive universe, this Loot verse of like, I think within 2 weeks, there was more than 60 projects building on top of it because it was so simple. But each one of them built on top of it roughly in the same way. Basically, you take the Loot contract, you fork it, which means you copy it, change a few variables, and then you spit out a new one. And the new one can change the color, it can change the words, it could actually do visuals, you can make maps or little characters or whatever. So in those cases, it's slightly different. But at the base of it was this token URI function. The token URI function is basically, what makes an NFT an NFT. When you go to, figure out what the artwork of an NFT is, you call this function, and typically it would return to you a link to something on the internet, a JPEG, a video file, whatever. In the case of Loot and other on-chain art, what it returns to you is what's here on the left, all of this gobbledygook code, which is base 64 encoded. So it basically takes a big long string of information, which is both the metadata and the image itself, encoded in human readable text. And then it smashes it all together to make it smaller in this base 64 encoded text. And then the internet already has baked in the ability to kind of decompress that or decode that, and then, spit it out as this image on the right with the black square.
So let me just try for the benefit of viewers to unpack that token URI function. So when you say, if you were to select all that text there, which looks like gobbledygook, but it's base 64 encoding. If you went online and you looked for a base 64 decoder, and you decoded it, what you'd then see is HTML or like HTML type text, as well as like some metadata, right? Like the title of the NFT and, you know, description, etc. And then the SVG component of that. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. And then it's that then browsers can would render, right, as an image. So one question I do have, so and that's this technique of like rather than like just linking to a file like most like most NFT does do where they'll link to an image or a video, Loot you know creates this SVG dynamically and then serves it up. So one question that I've had, because I've heard you make this description before, is was Loot the first to use that token URI function that way? And if it's not, and I believe it's not, because I think that Uniswap predated it. What is the significance of Loot? Where was it like a critical moment where that insight exploded, or what do you see as the significance of Loot?
Yeah, it's hard to know if Loot was a truly organic phenomenon or not. I mean, one of the creators is, you know, created the social media network Vine, right? So it's sort of like OG tech person with, you know, a lot of followers on Twitter. And then also made a number of other projects in advance of this, like the Noun project, I think he was a co-creator of. And the Noun project also uses this format, this base64 encoding. So there was something kind of building over the last summer, right? Like if 2020 summer was DeFi summer, then like we just experienced NFT summer. And it felt like at the end of NFT summer, there was this like converging consensus that, hey, like the convention that, you know, you have this NFT, this non-fungible token that's on the blockchain, but the only thing that's, you know, immutably pressed into the blockchain is a link to something elsewhere, is not going to, you know, hold up long term. And that's where your idea of K-spec and what we've been building there is, you know, allows us to kind of retroactively fix those problems. But I think what, you know, so this idea of doing it on chain was already a solution. When Loot came along, I think what Loot added to it was, you know, when you said Bitcoin is magic, I would make that slightly more specific and say that it's a specific type of magic, which I think it's a hyperstition. A hyperstition is basically a fiction that makes itself real in its effects. And so Bitcoin, you know, it was this thing, Satoshi Nakamoto, who themselves was a hyperstition. We don't even know if they exist. It could have been Hal Finney, it could be the NSA, it could be, you know, aliens from outer space beaming things to, you know, or it could be some like middle-aged dad in, you know, Los Angeles. I think that was one of the places that people thought they found Satoshi Nakamoto. So Satoshi is a hyperstition. Bitcoin, I think, is a hyperstition. If you look at the stock to flow model and the history of Bitcoin's price action, it's a bunch of hype cycles, right? And what drives Bitcoin? It's narrative. And what narratives basically operates through hype cycles. People get excited about something, everybody floods in, it crashes, some people stick around, they build the future, and then everybody comes back. And I feel like Loot was sort of like, you know, arriving on the plateau of productivity of the hype cycle of on-chain art. And I think the way that they got there was by presenting a project that itself was a hyperstition. So Loot is the game. Basically it's the character feature set for a game that doesn't even exist yet. But, you know, as I showed in those previous slides, if this is where it started and this is how it's going, within minutes, people were building, you know, the maps and the narratives and the characters and the interface and everything else. And because they could see it, they could see that, you know, the other thing, Loot, if you just, you know, if you look at the verbiage, the language, you know, the tagline for Loot was Dungeons and Degens. It's building on top of Dungeons and Dragons, which if you can imagine the Venn overlap of crypto natives and, you know, people that are familiar with these games, it's probably a fairly meaty overlap. So you take something that's culturally relevant to the people that are, you know, technologically sophisticated enough and financially solvent enough to participate, and you give them something that is culturally relevant to them. and you do something that's technologically more sound, right? This is
Mm-hmm.
like truly in the
Yeah.
spirit of blockchain. So that's a really long answer to what could have been a short answer, but I just feel like the one line answer is like the reason I think loot worked is because it was the right hyperstition at the right time.
Right.
And what it indicates to me is that the evolution of the blockchain as a magical kind of entity, as
Mm-hmm.
something that's literally alive and has its own agency, currently that torch is being carried by on-chain art.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what
Yeah.
we went. That's what we went to the artist with when we
Yep.
called up the artist who's already in our collection, and said, "Hey, we think you're brilliant. Are you familiar with this?" They said yes, and then we said, "What do you think about it?" And like 5 days later, we got this email. No, no hello, no nothing. Not because they're rude, but just like here's a brain dump, and they
Mm-hmm.
gave us the definition of Daemonica, and a handful of kind of like early sketches of what it might be. And the concept was that, sort of influenced, clearly influenced by loot at the beginning, that these entities they weren't text based, they weren't language based, they weren't kind of culturally legible at that level. They were more basic, they were numerical. And numerics is what drives the blockchain. Cryptography is all about like number theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is sort of like, what would be the ghosts haunting? What ghosts are already haunting the blockchain, and what might they look like, and what might they be made of? And this is what the artist came up with. These are what they called entities within this world of on-chain art, base 64 art on the blockchain. Um, there might be these things that have this kind of mercurial quality, the strange quality of being an 8x8 matrix of numbers. And as soon as you have that, you have different characters, right? You have like totally random matrices, you have permutation matrices like the one in the
Mm-hmm.
middle, you have a magic square, the one on the right. Each row is the first row is the same as the first column, the second row is the same as the second
Mm-hmm.
column, and so on. So you get certain matrices that have special qualities, and as a result, each one had to have like its own name. And
Mm-hmm.
so with the artist, we came up with, looked around the world for sacred syllables and came up with a way of kind of mashing them together to create, these are the first 88 names in the
Yeah.
Daemonica universe. But then the real work was, how do you take a base 64 piece of art, run it through some kind of black box, some kind of
Mm-hmm.
operation with this idea of creating something that is esoteric, that is ephemeral, and
Mm-hmm.
also numerological, and then create the entities. And
Yep.
that's what we had to figure out.
So, OX, before we go into the detail, I want to wonder if you could take us back to the email, just to really emphasize, because I think really in all the emails that I've seen, really the one that really catalyzed, and it took me a while to understand it, that really catalyzed the idea in my mind was the artists there, the very first sentence in their email. So I was wondering if you could read that to us, or to everybody that might be listening to this, and parse out what it means to you now, and maybe what it meant to you at the time. Yeah, just to help us understand.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is in the context of, well, actually, I don't have to read the context. I'll just read the text. So it says here, blockchain equals a new manifestation of what the Pythagorean / Neoplatonic / Western mystic tradition considers as a vital aspect of the divine domain, an incorporeal space where everything is saved, nothing is forgotten, and creation is an act of renewal. Right. So that's literally the first sentence that we get from this artist about this project. And you were right in dredging it out of the 20,000 words of email exchanges as like, not only is this the first, it's also the kind of framing. My reading of it is, the Western occult tradition, like there's this idea that kind of Western civilization, in a way, current Western civilization starts with Greece, which is, a kind of like frankly racist idea. It came from a very racist moment in kind of recent history. And the reason it's racist is because it's sort of like you can't go much further east until you stop finding people that look European than Greece. And if you do, you end up at all the people that developed for literally tens of thousands of years, the insights and the culture that fed into Greece. So like Egyptians and the Harappan culture of kind of northern India and people in Indonesia, and then all the way back to like Australia, where literally the oldest, persistent cultures on Earth have been living for, roughly around 70,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
And they have stories that will tell you things that happened 70,000 years ago that are like literally showing up in the archaeological record or geological record. So like cleaving human history at 2,000 years ago is like the tip of the iceberg.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, Pythagorean is interesting because Pythagoras is basically a cipher for everything that came before. Pythagoras is the word that we give to some person who may or may not have lived,
Mm-hmm.
who, most likely was, if they did live, was at the very least influenced by, if not themselves trained as an Egyptian temple priest. Plato, who came later, you see the Neoplatonic here, Plato, who
Mm-hmm.
came later, is thought to have spent 13 years or so in an Egyptian temple, learning these things that humans have been carrying with them for tens of thousands of years and kind of scratching away at to understand better. And so the Western mystic tradition is basically a capsule of all of those kind of human innovations that go back to our kind of animist ancestors and probably
Mm-hmm.
even beyond humans to Neanderthals and others.
Mm-hmm.
We found weird cave drawings and so on of. And so the blockchain puts it in that history in the same way you did with Newton and Planck and quantum and whatnot. And so here it's a new manifestation of this tradition that can, that considers as a vital aspect of the divine domain an incorporeal space where everything is saved, nothing is forgotten, and creation is an act of renewal. That's, talk to any indigenous culture in the world and anyone that's familiar with their basic cosmology, at least the cosmology that they'll say out loud. And they'll basically tell you this is how the universe works,
Mm-hmm.
right? That it's an incorporeal space where everything is saved, nothing is forgotten, and creation is, in Australia, Aboriginal Australians say it the turnaround. That's
Mm-hmm.
what creation is. It's the turnaround. And so this artist has basically given us a kind of key to the universe and attached it, identified it with the blockchain.
And I want to dwell on this just for a second because it's really what kicked everything off.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I see their Pythagoras, Neoplatonic, Western mystic tradition. Why not? I don't know. Again, like this is, I'm out of my depth here, but why not Shinto, Buddhism, or or some non-Western, right? Or pre-Columbian. Why the focus on Pythagoras, Plato, Western mysticism?
I think I don't want to answer for the artist, but our
Or yeah,
conversation.
what's your interpretation of why that is?
Well, my guess is that where we started was, the prompt to the artist in early September was, "Hey, have you heard of loot?" And then we had a call and we looked at loot and we looked at the N project and some of the other
Mm-hmm.
things kind of around the kind of the emerging loot verse at the time. And they were like, "Oh, that's so cool. There's a market, there's a valuation mechanism for the N project based on prime numbers."
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, "That's hilarious. It's like Pythagorean mathematics is structuring, the opinions of market participants in on-chain art of the blockchain circa September 2021." So I think that's what they were riffing on, was kind of
Mm-hmm.
like seeing what was emerging. But their take was, one thing they said to us at the very beginning was, "Okay, if we're going to do this, loot's super cool, it's super advanced, but the aesthetics of it are kind of juvenile, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like katana sword and stuff like this, right? It's um, which is probably why it works so well. It's sort of like deceiving in its kind of juvenilia. But what the artist was really interested in was kind of like, what is a more adult take on that? Like,
Mm-hmm.
how could you treat it real? How could you treat the blockchain as they put here as, an incorporeal space where, as they said. So yes, the Platonic thing, the Pythagorean kind of origin is maybe where we started.
Yeah.
But you can see that each entity gets a name. The
Mm-hmm.
name is, as I mentioned, it's a concatenation of syllables. And working with the artist, we developed, I think there's 89 syllables. So from 0 to 88, 89 syllables that are everything from basic vowels to ancient Egyptian, Sanskrit,
Mm-hmm.
uh, Karo, which is a kind of the last living ancestors of the Inca and the Andes, Chinese Shinto, and then we had a little fun with it. We put Urbit in here,
Right.
fairy, angels, Goetia. When you hear Daemonica, and also the other word that was previously Neoplatonic, Neoplatonism was an attempt to basically bring a kind of Platonic rigor, a mathematical hierarchical rigor to all of these like weird spirits that were floating around this world that was very synchronistic at that time, where like Alexandria in Egypt was like literally like if you arrived on like the Alexandrian Empire stretched like, you know, all the way to India. So if you arrived on a ship in Alexandria, first thing they would do is they get on your boat and they would take all your books, confiscate them, and then copy them. And if you're lucky, you got them back. And if you didn't, you got the copy back. They're basically collecting all of human knowledge into one place. And, you know, Library of Alexandria.
Right.
And, you know,
I was not aware that's how it was put together.
yeah. And I don't have to tell you that's like, you know, the place of magic, right? So,
Right.
Neoplatonism was an attempt to sort of like take that kind of corpus of Hermetic understanding that was left at the time, and really give it this rigid, almost computer like, you know, computer coding like feel, where all of the different daemons, which are not demons, that's a kind of churchianity kind of take on daemons.
Right.
Daemons were
Daemon. Right.
Yeah, that's right. And so daemon is an amoral kind of entity that has a particular agency, but it doesn't have its own kind of free will. So it's very specific, and it's why Linux, you know, like the Linux kernel will have daemons running. The threads that run our computers are called daemons because we control them, we turn them on and off. But they're powerful, and if they're misused, they can be incredibly powerful. And so Goetia, which is here, is a kind of later way of using that kind of Neoplatonic spirit hierarchy of interacting with and doing this kind of strange magic.
Yeah. So let me just tie the knot on that first sentence, because I heard another description from you, which really helped me in the understanding. So, which was something along the lines of, you know, one interpretation of that sentence, which is, look, if we treat the blockchain as effectively it's like a magical, living, divine entity, then what do the or fabric maybe, or like universe, what do the entities inside that blockchain look like, feel like, you know, what do they behave like? And that the exploration of that question is really then what informed the actual development of the Daemonica project. Yeah, I'd like to get your reaction to that.
Yeah. So they look like what the artist saw when he saw them, or they or she saw them. Let me just say that again. So they look like what the artist saw or rendered when they saw them. So these matrices, this 8x8 matrix, is what, you know, what the artist visualized when they try to look into the blockchain. And our job was to figure out how you could extract that from the blockchain itself. And almost as a test, like you can make any, you know, you could just come up with a random algorithm to do this.
Yeah.
But
it's going to be gimmicky if you don't, you know, if you don't find something meaningful, right? Just do it random.
It'll be a product of your own fancy,
right?
As opposed to a conjuration. And so that was, I think, the challenge was, were we just painting a portrait? Like, were we copying the image that an artist sent us of what they saw when they looked into on-chain art on the blockchain? Or were we on a treasure hunt to figure out if indeed these entities, these 8x8 matrices, are actually already latent?
Right. Right. So it's like they, right? He, she, they visualized it and visualized something very interesting. Then the question is, how do you create magic or a model or a map or whatever that can create something as significant at will, right? Some sort of like framework that allows you to recreate that magic that is there, like it's real. You just have to find a way to manifest it.
Yeah. And I mean, that's if you think that the blockchain is its own universe with its own physics,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore its own metaphysics,
Mm-hmm.
then if you just use it like a paintbrush and paint whatever you want, um, you're not exploring the limits of that physics. But if you treat it like a physicist,
Mm-hmm.
who's trying to understand the
Mm-hmm.
underlying, nature of it,
Yeah.
and you've been given a clue, right?